Hi there, this is a video for best practice for data workflows for iShare administrators. We're going to demonstrate the main differences between version 5 and version 6 in iShare. There's going to be a fair bit of examples in how to create schemas, how to create users, how to do sort of basic administration, and the majority of that content is available on that URL there, tiny.cc/aston-workflows. So without further ado, let's get into it. So let's look at first the architectural changes between version 5, which is this, and version 6. In version 5, you would have your spatial data warehouse on a Windows server that had an internal DNS of SDW.aston.lan, if you had seen that in your map source connections in Studio. The application databases are called iShare data on both GIS and the one over here on maps. This would sit on the Windows servers where the iShare application is, and that would hold the gazetteer. It might hold some spatial data. It was PostGIS enabled, and it would have all the functions necessary for the applications to function. Communication to all those databases used a super user account called iShare data, which I'm sure you've seen before. And that's one of the changes that's occurred in version 6. In version 6, we don't have the databases sitting on the iShare servers anymore. We have, for iShare Maps, the Maps database. It's no longer called iShare data. It's just called Maps, and that's the application database for iShare Maps. And that sits on the new database server, which happens to be a Linux server. The internal DNS for this is db.aston.internal. So again, you might see that in Studio, in GIS and Maps when looking at workflow connections. The application database for iShare GIS has been amalgamated with the SDW. So that's why you don't see a GIS state database there. The gazetteer and the functions for iShare GIS to perform its function, that all sits within the SDW. There's no superuser role shared between these two applications with these databases. We've split out roles for security reasons, so we'll come on to those next. Oh, first, yes, change about the databases. So because Postgres has been upgraded to, I think, 17 in iShare 6, we are following industry standard of not using the public schema. This is one for a security measure, which is beyond the scope of this video, but it also provides a means to have cleaner table names, less ambiguity. You would have custom schemas, my schema dot my table, that kind of thing. So I think that's pretty common for all customers in version 5. They're doing that already, and now that is the norm in version 6. When you have ETL migrating, say, non-spatial data via a data share connection, that would historically have gone to the public schema. Now that's not possible. The default destination for that data is now what's known as the data share schema. It doesn't have to be that as the destination. You can select any schema in the destination database. Functions used to live in the public schema. They've all been migrated to two schemas, Aston and iShare. You'll find the SDW functions are within the Aston schema. iShare functions, which include workflow functions, they all sit within the iShare schema. And no surprise, when it comes to functions that require a table name as a parameter, such as there's a workflow function for creating geometry points from X and Y fields. Before that just contained table name, X column, Y column. That now has 4 parameters with the additional one for the schema name. So you'll see that a lot if you navigate the function list within the Maps database or the SDW. The majority of those functions now carry a schema name as well. So database roles, I mentioned that the iShare data superuser is no longer in existence in iShare version 6. So what we have in regards to the ETL are 2 roles. One's called iShare data _GIS, and the other's iShare data _maps. These iShare data roles are focused on the transfer of data from ETL, from internal data sources, and also the administration of those two databases. So you can use those roles for creating schemas and for the SDW, creating users and applying permissions to those users. On the right hand side, you can see the two iShare applications. They're using separate roles for communication to the database. They're using iShare web service roles. On the whole, those are read-only roles, and you'll find that the iShare web service _maps role, that won't have access to the SDW, and like for like, the GIS role won't have access to the maps database. So for administration, I mentioned you can use the iShare data roles, or in this case, the SDW, it's the iShare data _GIS, or you could have a member of the SDW admin group. So when you create a new user, you can set them up as an administrator of the SDW. And if you do that, they become a member of that group, SDW _admin. And the iShare data _GIS role, the one used by ETL, that's also a member of the SDW admin group. And it's that group that has the permissions to do all those kind of duties, create schemas, create users, apply permissions, and so forth. If I come on to my ETL demonstration box, we've got two examples of creating schemas. The first one, I'll just expand it in a minute. It's to create an unrestricted schema, and then we'll follow up with a restricted schema. When you create a schema, there we go. This is the first function that you need to do. It's calling a function called aston.sdw new schema. It takes two parameters. One is the schema name, and there is for the second parameter, a staff access, which controls whether it is restricted or not. This one is unrestricted, so this value is set to true. When that function runs, it creates 4 background database roles that are associated with that schema. You can see at the bottom here they are mentioned, and they are schema owner, schema editor, schema viewer, and schema creator. And by granting those 2 other roles, we can control whether a user has access to that schema or has editing rights to that schema, and so forth. So the next standard task that we do is grant test unrestricted owner to editor. And this simply allows that new schema to receive new tables. So the editor role controls whether tables can be created or not. So that's vitally important that grant occurs after creating a schema. Third one, grant the schema viewer to iShare reader. This allows the iShare GIS application to have read-only access to that table. The fourth task is optional. This will allow the iShare GIS application to have editing rights, or set it up for editing rights if required for data within that schema. So for editing in GIS, you would still need to assign a role to the map source and apply editing rights to that role, to that layer within map source. This is just a background permission that allows that transaction to occur. And lastly, we will just put some data into this unrestricted schema. Wonderful. And then we'll do exactly the same for a restricted schema. This time the schema name is test restricted. Staff access this time is false. So everything else is like for like. So we'll just let that run. And now I'm going to create some users. So there's 2 tasks for each user that needs to be created. The first one is making use of this aston.sdw new user function, 3 parameters, username, password, and then an option to make them administrators. So in this case, our example user is a standard user. They will be a member of a group called SDW staff, and everyone is a member of that, but they won't be a member of SDW admin. The second task for each user is to allow them to connect to the database. And then we'll repeat that exercise, but for a admin user. So in this case, username is example, SDW admin user, and the make admin is set to true. And we'll also give them the right to connect. So we've got 2 schemas. One is unrestricted and one is restricted. We've got 2 users. And if we go into QGIS, we've got my example admin user and we've got the example user. So if I expand example user, travel down to, I need to refresh that connection. You can see here, this is our 2 schemas that we've created. In test unrestricted, there's that points layer that this user can see, but in test restricted, there is a points layer that the user is not allowed to see. Yes, so in terms of allowing that user then to see that data, we need to grant them access. So let's have a look at that. So hopefully this makes sense. We have the schema name where the restricted data resides, and we are granting that schema viewer to this user. Now we might grant the schema viewer to the planning group, and then individual members are granted planning. You might work it that way, but in this case we've just done it for one particular user. So if I come back into QGIS and then refresh, drop down to my test restricted, there we go. I had to do refresh on the schema, but you can see that the points are now accessible. Some techniques regarding ETL. One request that we've seen a couple of times is people struggle with handling very large web feature service imports into the SDW. In particular, things like the flood zone areas from the Environment Agency. So we've got a technique to handle that, which works very well with OGR3, which comes with iShare 6. Here's my job for importing flood zones. We've got a standard spatial data transformation. I've got my connection defined up here, which we'll look at in a minute. Destination, and I'm using the name of my connection. I've actually put my role in just to remind me which role I'm using to connect to the SDW. The destination table and schema. And down the bottom, I've used a parameter called spat, which defines a spatial bounding box for my requests. So I am not downloading national coverage. It's too big for my purposes. I'm downloading essentially a bounding box to Surrey, and any data that intersects that bounding box will be downloaded. The other parameter that I've got here is OGR WFS paging allowed. So rather than making a single request, I'm making a series of page requests. So I'm breaking up that request into several pages, and OGR is very comfortable in handling that. To make sure that our paging is correctly done with no duplicates, we change our WFS connection to have a sort by parameter. So this would typically be the primary key. So by declaring that, we are making sure that the data is all sorted, essentially permanently for all our paged requests. So we're not going to repeat ourselves in that. Once that data all comes in, let's look at performance. So the first task here is reindex a table. This one isn't actually necessary for a data set that you're importing and you're not editing. This is really for an internal data set that you are editing in the spatial data warehouse by many users, and re-indexing sorts it out for the analysis planning mechanism of Postgres when running queries. The vacuum analyze is useful for both kinds of data, so I'd recommend running that. And then this one sets up the table to be clustered on the geometry index. So by clustering, we mean the actual physical storage of that data on that hard drive where that database sits, whether it's on the cloud or not. And the cluster actually performs that action. So Alter Table sets up for further recording of records to be recorded by the geometry index. Then clustering actually performs essentially a rewrite of that table based upon the geometry index. And that makes a lot of sense, because if you imagine you're zooming into an area, Postgres wants to retrieve all those features within that map window that you're seeing. And by clustering, we're really helping out Postgres in getting those features out of the database into the iShare application as soon as possible. And we run analyze at the end just to make sure that the planning tool in Postgres makes best use of the way that the table's been set up. So I'd recommend running those 4 operations on large tables, and very large tables or complex tables, and introduce reindex where you have a table that is undergoing a lot of edits as well. For those tables, I'd recommend setting up auditing as well, which also comes with the spatial data warehouse by default. So next on our list is looking at data that the ETL would transfer to the SDW, and that is both spatial and non-spatial. So this is a diagram of how that would work. Normally, you would have internal data sources on the left-hand side. Non-spatial would be imported via external data share connection, and spatial data would make use of a spatial data transformation task. And both of them can go to the SDW. The data share connections would go to the public schema in version 5, but that's not possible in version 6 because we've locked that down. So now there is an option to choose the destination schema, and the default one for that is a schema called data share, which will be present on all SDWs. But we'd really recommend you not using external data share connections for that purpose. OGR is very good at reading in data from all the data providers that the data share connections offer, and obviously more, and it will handle spatial data as equally well as non-spatial data. It is most definitely faster than the external data share connections can perform. The testing that I've done, it works out about 5 times as fast, so it is well worth doing. It is certainly more flexible in terms of the additional parameters that you can put in and the amount of SQL adjustments and processing that you can put in. It's a fantastic tool for that. The other great thing about it is that you can choose the destination database, schema, and table. So the data share connections have to go to the declared data share database, which is the SDW for the majority of customers. With spatial data transformations, you can choose whatever database it is, or obviously flat file. But you can, in our cases, you'd be choosing between the SDW and the maps databases as the exports. Going the other way, going back into internal data sources, if you've got Microsoft SQL Server, iShare 6 comes with OGR 3.10, and that can make use of Microsoft's bulk copy program, which really is transformative in the speeds that it can import data into SQL Server. It's about 90% more efficient than using standard spatial data transformation tasks. So I'd really recommend, if you're writing out to SQL Server, it's nothing to do with reading in, it's writing out to these databases, make sure that you have bulk copy program parameters enabled. There's more information on the OGL, the gdal.org website for that. Let's have a look at Maps Administration. That's a lot simpler than the Spatial Data Warehouse. There's really just two things you need to do, is create schemas and move data into those schemas, and I suppose drop schemas as well. So I've talked about spatial data transformation task being the method of either reading in non-spatial or spatial data. That's grand. And we want to keep a separation between data in the SDW and the data in maps. So the data in maps is solely for iShare maps. And we don't want the iShare maps application to have actually any information about connecting to the SDW. We would prefer that all data resides in the maps database, and that's the only place that it gets data from. So if you do have a need to have data in both iShare GIS or QGIS, so that for that it'll be the SDW. If you need that data in iShare maps as well, rather than having iShare maps read from the SDW, we are recommending you move that data into the maps database as well. And we find that maps databases are fairly about minuscule compared to the overall size of the SDW. In terms of things like planning applications, where perhaps you've got possibly over 200 fields of data stored in the SDW for your planning applications table, in the maps database, you might only need less than 10. So just make sure that if you are transferring data across the maps database, have a think about what you actually need to transfer. If those columns, if those fields are coming across and they're not used, you're doing yourself a disservice, because the requests are going to be slower because it has to hop through all that data stored, and if it's not being used, it's unnecessary. So previously we had two spatial data transformations, taking the same data from internal data sources to both databases. You might also do this method. So you might move it into the SDW first, and then take it from there into the maps database, and that would be performed by the ETL. The ETL is the only part of the iShare infrastructure that has information about both databases, and that's stored in your internal network, so it's safe. What you could do here, once it's moved into the SDW, is do some processing on it and then transfer it to maps. We've got an example of this coming up. So here is a data share and spatial data transformation task using the same data. If I come up to my data share connections, here we are. We're reading in from just a sample CSV file. I think it's NHS data. And down here, I've got the equivalent reading the same, essentially they're both being loaded as non-spatial. But here's the equivalent spatial data transformation task. So here I've got force geometry set to none. I'm choosing my destination. In this case, it's the SDW. And yeah, and that's about it. When it comes to processing data in the SDW and then exporting, let's have a look at that. So we are going to set up points layer in a schema called test points. And then we've got one called test polygons, test polygons.point. Sorry, test polygons.polygons. There we go. So we've got one in each. So if you think back to the schema roles that are associated with each schema, when it comes to creating the schema, the owner of the view, which in this case, there's the view there I've created called points with polygons view. Now that sits in this test points schema. So the test point owner needs to have access to the test polygons table. So in order for this to work, we need to grant it that to happen. So remember that the view is in the test points. So we're going to grant test polygons viewer to test points owner. And we do that. And then this view is now accessible. So if I just copy that, I'll load up PG admin. We're in iShare Data GIS and get a new query window. And there's my points, and at the end I've got the name from the polygon field. So this view wouldn't be accessible. It would be able to be defined, but when running it, it would fall over with a permissions denied error. And that's because the grant needs to be set. So just to make sure it's understood, we are granting access to this data to the owner of this schema because this is where the view is stored. Now we've got our data set up with the polygon names over in the, we want to get it into the maps database. So for that, we need to create a schema. Creating schemas in maps is a lot more straightforward. There isn't any consideration really to do with access. There's really just one role for creating schemas and moving data. That's iShare data _maps. And to read that data, that's the iShare web service. And that is wrong. That should be maps. So that would enable the iShare Maps application to read that data. And then moving the data straightforward as you would expect. On the left-hand side, we have the spatial data warehouse using the iShare data _GIS role. And that is reading from our view that we've created. And on the right-hand side, we've got the destination, which is the maps database using the iShare data _maps role. And that's creating the data in that new schema that we've just created. Just want to talk about ETL, scheduling, and notification. So our database servers, they obviously sit on AWS. They receive a backup every night, and that backup requires a reboot. And it is a fairly quick reboot, and it happens for both iShare servers and database servers. And that reboot, we are given a window when that happens, and it is between midnight and 2 a.m. every day. And we can't fine tune it any more than that. That is the window that we're granted, and all backups occur during that time. So we want to make sure that you guys know about your scheduling. So just avoid that time period between midnight and 2 a.m. and just be mindful that though you might kick your job off at, say, 11 o'clock, if it takes an hour and a half, then it will lead into that time, and there's a chance that it may not complete. If things don't complete, you want to make sure that your workflow notifications are set up. And this is the mechanism where Studio ETL, when it's asked to do something, run a scheduled job, and for whatever reason that job fails, such as it can't talk to either database or network path, or there's a typo in the SQL that it's been asked to use, it wants to send an email to a series of email addresses. And if that isn't configured, then you as iShare administrators won't know about the failure. To find that, come up to Workflow, select Edit on the right-hand side, then Notification Setup is then enabled. If you click that, then you've got the details of the mail server and who the recipients are for that email. I would recommend setting up a generic sort of team email address, GIS at my council, etc. And just make sure that is set up correctly by running the test. And then you can be reassured that any schedules that failed, you're going to be notified. You can go in, fix it, and if you can't fix it, then you raise a support desk query with us. Lastly, I just want to touch upon sort of security measures regarding VPN and encryption. Back to our glorious architectural diagram for iShare. This is the version 6 one, but it also applies, this information applies to version 5 as well. Would really recommend that between our estate in Amazon, AWS, and your own network, that there's a VPN tunnel set up. Once that's set up, then all data going through is not exposed through the internet, it's going through the VPN. That includes staff web browser traffic to iShare GIS, but more importantly, which is encrypted anyway, obviously because it's HTTPS, but your data transfers from Studio ETL also goes through the VPN, and that by default is not encrypted. If that VPN wasn't there, we'd strongly recommend that Studio ETL, those connections are set up to be encrypted traffic to your databases. So please check that you have the correct setup, have a discussion with your security team. Those are the type of things that you want to find out, what you want to be reassured by. If that VPN isn't there, then obviously whitelisting would be in place, and we want to make sure that that whitelisting range is up to date as well. So we need advice from you on when that changes, and if that range shrinks, then you need to tell us to make that adjustment on our end and not leave it unnecessarily larger than it has to be. Just one final thing regarding the SDW, we'd recommend that there is an internal DNS set up. There's no charge for doing an internal DNS, and you can set that up rather than in QGIS when you're connecting to your database. Rather than having an IP address, you can have something like sdw.mycouncil.gov.uk, and that enables them to have a connection to that database. And if that IP address was to ever change, only the internal DNS needs changing to that new IP address, and it relieves QGIS users from having to update their connection details. So I'd really recommend making use of that. I think that's it. Thank you for your patience. As I said at the start, more information is available on our iShare help pages. You can go there on tiny.cc/Aston-workflows. That will take you to this best practice for data workflows page. And obviously, if you have any further questions, don't hesitate, get in touch with your account manager. They'll be very pleased to take your call. Thank you.